Good evening, everyone. I'm the storyteller, and I am here to help you sleep better with true horror stories. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like my video. I would love to know where you are from and what time you're watching this video. So please leave a comment to let me know, and I will draw from that experience to tell even better stories. When you are ready, feel free to relax. My name is Emilio, and I spent a number of years living on the streets in the 1990s. When I was 21, I got a job as a security guard at a popular nightclub in the city. However, during that time, I started using illegal drugs and got into bad company, which led to my job loss. Eventually, I was left on the streets with nowhere to go because my parents had died when I was young, and I was essentially alone in the world. Every time I think back on that period of my life, I get a knot in my stomach because I witnessed and experienced a lot of unpleasant things while I was homeless. Aside from attempting to obtain food, one of the most difficult things was finding a place to stay during the rainy season and appropriate clothing. It was one of those rainy nights when I had the most terrifying experience of my life. Not just at that stage. I had very little time to be on the streets at that time, and I began to meet people who were in similar circumstances to me. Gave me tips on how to make some cash, buy food, and pay for my addiction. So I started taking on odd jobs at the neighborhood market, like sweeping the grounds and assisting with loading and unloading the trucks that brought in produce. While working at that job, I met Furman and Freckles, two other homeless men my age, who asked me where I was staying because it was raining at the time. I told them I was staying in a church where I could spend the night and shield myself from them. These guys told me that they were staying in an abandoned warehouse about 4 blocks away. I recall that Fine told me that there was a large group of people there that had mattresses, blankets, and bonfires, and that they had made bonfires. With the little money I made at the market, I could buy some food each day, but by that time things get a little complicated because there aren't many odd jobs to do anymore and the market activity has decreased due to the rain. He also invited me to stay with him there. I thanked him, but explained that I felt safe where I was at the time, and that the main reason I didn't go with them was because I knew that these people were using a much stronger and dangerous subs. Tans than what I used to use. To go into specifics, this was something that claimed many lives every year, and to be honest, I was already in a deep hole. He assured me that it was less dangerous because homeless people who were alone used to experience bad things in that city, and it is always safer to be with a group of people. That year, the rainy season was very intense, and it had rained for 4 days almost consecutively, so there was no work and the place where I was staying started to get wet. So I didn't want to put myself at any more risk than I already was. Then, one day, I had no choice but to seek shelter with them. I searched the square for a dry place to stay, but I was unable to find one. Then, I ran into Fine, who was carrying some bags with blankets that a nearby neighbor had given him. He told me that when he saw me soaked and shivering and was looking for a place to stay warm, he came up to me and offered me a place to stay at the shelter where he was. He informed me that they had gotten food and that there was space for one more person. He showed me the blankets and promised to give me one for the night because by this point, I was too cold and hungry. This time, I accepted his offer without hesitation and accompanied him to the abandoned warehouse. After walking for approximately 5 blocks in the rain, we finally reached the location, which was a rather large warehouse. It was completely sealed, the entrance was covered in lumber, there was trash all over the place, and the smell, well, it wasn't something I wasn't used to, but as soon as we got inside, I realized I hadn't been duped because there were actually quite a few bonfires and candles. People dispersed in various groups, but as we were walking, I heard someone criticizing Fine for bringing me. This person seemed to be very irritated that Fine had brought someone else to the location, telling him that there were already too many people there and that they were avoiding starvation. So why would he bring another mouth? I instantly stood still, unable to move, and Fearine put his arm around me and said, "Don't worry, he is nobody to decide who comes and who does not at all." When he told the man that he was the one who had originally obtained that warehouse and that he would not be able to house me in his place, they had a brief conversation. Eventually, the man said nothing more, and we continued to walk, but as I approached, I started to smell a strong smell of grilled meat. Because I was so hungry, my stomach started to growl. So I instinctively started to investigate the source of the smell and discovered that it was coming from the back of the warehouse to be honest, I was a little surprised that they were grilling meat because meat is expensive and there was a large group of people there, so it would take a good amount to feed them all. In addition, there were no butcher shops nearby to have given them leftovers or anything. The largest group of people were sitting around a bonfire, and they were not only throwing trash to keep the fire going, but they were also making food there. They heard the sound of my guts fine, laughed, and said to me, "Calm down, buddy. I'll get you some meat to eat." Anything like that. But I was too hungry and didn't really care that Furman went to the campfire site while I remained where I was because I didn't want to start another fight over food this time. My friend came over and gave me some pieces of meat in the lid of a milk can, which I immediately started eating and thanked him for because he was not only keeping me warm, but also from starvation. He simply told me to relax, friend, because that's what we are here for, to support one another. I thought it was very noble of him, to be honest. The meat was good, but it tasted strange. I had never eaten any meat that tasted like that, and it was obviously not beef, but I told them that I was starving and that I was grateful that they shared some with me. After I finished my plate, I continued to follow Fine, who was directing me to the location where I would stay, which was in the right corner of the warehouse's back, and I had to pass close to the bonfire to get there. As I passed the area where they were roasting meat, I glanced in that direction and was instantly frozen. Very near the bonfire where everyone was cooking and eating, there was a human body on the ground with its torso open and missing all of its limbs. As I looked farther down, I noticed that someone was holding what appeared to be a leg with all of its limbs and was using a large knife to dissect the meat. My legs went limp and I felt a huge knot formed in my stomach. I couldn't help but start throwing up as everyone began yelling at me and complaining that I was ruining the place. I looked at Fair with a horrified expression, and he calmly told me, "Hey buddy, take it easy. Nobody did anything to him. He was already dead, and we can't afford to waste anything here. He is a survival brother. You should know that I can't describe the feeling I was experiencing at the time. There are no words to describe it. On the one hand, I was afraid of what I was witnessing, but I was even more horrified by the fact that there were many people present, including kids, who were eating from that man's body as though it were normal at that moment. I felt the agony of being in that circumstance and realized how terrible hunger can be. But more than anything, it was a great awakening because after throwing up everything I had eaten just a moment before and attempting to control the retching I still had, I put my hand on my friend's shoulder and thanked him for her. Fortunately, I still had the blanket Furman gave me, so I was able to spend the night there. The following day, by God's grace, the rain stopped, and when I woke up, I saw a group of missionaries from an evangelical church providing food and preaching to several people. I told him that I had to leave because I couldn't be there, and he looked at me and seemed to understand. He just nodded his head, and I made my way out of that area. One of the people on the street brought me a lunch and started talking to me about the Bible. They also told me about a free rehabilitation center where they could help me with my addiction problem so that I could change my life right then and there. Everything that happened the night before was replayed in my mind, and that gave me the motivation I needed to accept help and finally leave the dark world I was in. That same day, I was taken to the rehabilitation center, and by God's grace, I was able to overcome my addiction and get my life back on track. I joined the church, and since then, I've dedicated my life to helping the homeless and giving them the same chance that they gave me. Regretfully, my friend Fairman never wanted to leave the streets and died of an overdose shortly after. As for the man of that day, no one knew who he was, and the news never made it to the press. So it's possible that he was also homeless. My name is Andrew, and I'm 49 years old. I've lived in Miami for the majority of my life. So it goes without saying that I've heard and seen a lot of weird, unsettling, and ridiculous things. I could say that I may have been one of those famous Florida men in the past. But I can say with certainty that no matter how tough you think you are, how many battles you've faced, this man is always making headlines across the nation. As I mentioned before, I served in the Army for many years and took part in several significant operations. including Operation Red Dawn in Iraq. After that, for a variety of reasons, I spent a few years on the streets, bouncing between a rock and a hard place. Regardless of how many times you have fought or how many crazy things you have witnessed, life will always find a way to surprise you and show you that it will always have the power to shock you to your core. I've always been able to deal with the painful and shocking things I've seen or experienced, and generally, I recover well. However, out of all the things I've had to deal with, there was one that truly rocked me to my core, and I have to admit that I still have nightmares about it, because I never imagined that something like that could ever happen, let alone in the middle of the city. It was a gorgeous, sunny day in Miami, and like many others, I was driving through the city in the middle of I had not touched my car. Instead, I rode my bike everywhere because of the concrete mess caused by a road under construction for the past few months. That day was no different. I was riding my bike down the shoulder, but I wasn't riding it because I hadn't slept well the night before, and to be honest, I was too tired to pedal in a straight line. I was essentially walking beside my bike on the road shoulder. There was a pavement nearby, but it was on the other side of a concrete barrier, semi. I don't know how I got sandwiched between the cars and the concrete, but after what happened a few moments later, I would never take that road again as an alternative in my life. The sun was at its worst and was shining so brightly that it was beginning to hurt my eyesight. So I squinted to look ahead and saw that there was a bridge across the road, which was great because it was a nice wide flyover. I started to pick up my pace because I was finally getting some shade. That felt a little ridiculous given how many cars were driving by. But in the midst of the deafening noise of each one, I heard something else that I couldn't quite place. It sounded like a shouting argument that I couldn't fully comprehend, like a fight between intoxicated people. The screaming became louder. It definitely sounded like a scream, but there was something else there as well. It was like a dog growling or something. It was a really strange sound. But every time I thought I was going to figure it out, a car flew past me. In Miami, however, this is more than common, and I couldn't help but think that this sounded a little strange. At the time, I thought the lack of sleep was interfering with my thoughts, so I continued. When I eventually arrived at the bridge, my curiosity was piqued because I could tell that the location of the noise was directly in front of me, only a few more meters below the shadow. I glanced over the edge of the sidewalk barrier and noticed two pairs of men's hairy legs sliding over one another in the center of the sidewalk. I immediately turned away because I didn't want to see what was going on above thigh level. I recall that moment as these guys were going about their business, or so thinking, what's going through these guys' heads doing stuff like that on the side of the road and in the hot sun? The fact that no one stopped to do or say anything to them made it clear that no one cared. So I continued to walk in the bright sunshine, trying not to make a big deal out of it. I thought, just another day in Florida, and I tried my best to keep my eyes fixed while I rested for a moment under the shade. I was really thankful for the brief respite from the harsh sun, but then those odd noises began to be heard again. They sounded like the growls of some animal, and that made me turn to look again. That's when I saw the most eerie and bizarre thing I've ever seen in my life. Two naked men on the sidewalk's edge, one lying on the concrete, and the other crouching on top of him, tearing at his face with his teeth. I was completely shocked, which is not something that happens to me very often. Hematic fluid was leaking from the man, and bones were visible through the bites on the concrete. The most terrifying part was when a man raised his head and stared at me. It was like a real zombie attacking his victim, and I instantly jumped on my bike and pedaled at full speed. The adrenaline rush I had just experienced as I pedaled was so intense that I kept looking back to see if that psychopath was still there. The guy's face was on the floor, and the attacker was chewing on the victim's flesh and making noises like an animal growling. Fortunately, he wasn't following me. Apparently, he was too busy enjoying that unfortunate man. So, I continued pedaling as quickly as I could, rolled down the first ramp I came across on the road, and went straight to find a police officer. Fortunately, I found one fairly nearby, but he was surrounded by a number of people who appeared to be demanding something, and the officer appeared irritated. I was in a complete panic, and I never panic, so it must have been a sight to see as I forced my way through everyone, standing directly in the cop's face, shouted, "There's a zombie eating a man on the damn pedestrian path up the ramp." At that moment, everything fell silent. "What do you mean, zombie?" the policeman asked. "There's a guy eating another man's face," I said, and he stared at me. Then, as if something clicked in his brain, he walked straight into his car and said something over the radio before driving up the exit ramp in the opposite direction out of our sight. Meanwhile, the other civilians exchanged some odd looks, all in an understandable lack of. In a moment, 5 shots were fired, one after the other, and everyone on the street stopped what they were doing. A few minutes later, we saw a queue of police cars followed by an ambulance, and nearly simultaneously, a horde of journalists arrived to broadcast the news live from the scene that afternoon. Some of them appeared to be cyclists, while others simply looked like people who had gotten out of their cars. I wondered how long that thing had been doing that monstrosity with all those people. I discovered that the victim had been homeless after seeing headlines like "Cannibal Eats Florida, Homeless Man Zong," i.e. attack in Florida, and similar stories. For weeks, the topic was the talk of the town, and while some people seemed interested in it, I would never want to see images or videos of that terrible tragedy, because it was enough for me to be there for a few moments and be shocked for months. The hair on the back of my neck still stands up every time I go under a bridge. And occasionally it is not necessary to delve too deeply into the topic to know that my life has not been easy, and it never was. But this stage was perhaps the lowest point of my entire existence. Basically my day-to-day life. I have nightmares about that moment, but fortunately the man survived, albeit in very bad music shape. My name is Angel, and I am one of the many Mexican immigrants who left their home country and crossed the border in search of the American dream. But in my case, the dream turned into a nightmare, and I ended up living on the streets for several years. Was about going to any lengths to obtain food and stumbling through the alleys every night in search of a place to hide from the cold and nighttime dangers. I had nothing but a piece of cardboard for a bed and a stack of old, filthy cloth for a blanket, no family, no friends, no job, and essentially nothing to live for. I say this because there was something that plagued me while I was living on the streets. It was a thought that would not go away, a feeling that would not go away. And I did not comprehend why it was that one night when I was a few weeks old and living on the streets, I felt as though an icy air surrounded me. I was asleep at the time, but I woke up with that sensation and a sharp chill down my spine. I sat up on the filthy cardboard where I had been sleeping, put my hands inside the old wool coat I was wearing, which I had found in the trash a few days earlier, and looked around with a weird feeling that something or someone was watching me. The feeling persisted for many days, even months, and as the days passed, the nights grew increasingly unsettling until there was no longer a single night that I did not wake up knowing or believing that I was being watched. I searched everywhere and found nothing unusual, but it persisted no matter what, so I just forced myself to go back to sleep. However, this was only the first of many nights in which the same thing would happen to me, speaking in my ear as though whispering words to me that I couldn't recall for months. I tried to ignore all of these unsettling sensations that kept me awake every night and kept me from falling asleep. I told myself that it was all a result of my tired mind from not eating or sleeping enough, but one early morning, as I was walking the city streets looking for a place to sleep, or sleeping poorly like every night, I started to feel the same sensation that plagued me every day, but this time that entity that appeared before my eyes after months of stalking and disturbing my sleep. I know what actually happened because I wasn't asleep, I wasn't delirious, and I've never used illegal drugs, so I know it was real. And the rest was like a kind of tunic made entirely of shadow. It was very black, and the thick smoke didn't touch the ground. It just floated when this entity appeared in front of me. I was completely paralyzed. However, after it spoke to me, I realized that it was the same ghostly voice that I'd been hearing whispering in my ear every night. At that moment, a voice that seemed to be coming from the very tomb resounded in my mind, telling me, "Angel, it's your time." I tried to flee, but every alley I went down seemed to lead me back to that ghost. and I could feel her behind me with every step I took. For a moment, a dark thought crossed my mind as my heartbeat thundered in my ears, and that which I was certain was the manifestation of death approached me without my ability to stop it. I thought, why are you trying to escape? You have nothing worth living for. Just give yourself up. No one will miss you anyway. However, the survival instinct, which is ingrained in our primitive consciousness, refused to give up the fight, so I continued running even though I knew it was in vain. The only thing that came to mind was to sit down and pray with all the desperation I felt and ask God to save me from that spirit of death that was pursuing me at that moment. I saw how the spirit surrounded me and started to approach me slowly, and then I was already a little resigned, so I closed my eyes tightly. I was in a desperate attempt to escape my fate, practically marked, and found myself in front of a large church. It was a huge cathedral that is in that part of the city, but it was closed, and started praying what I believed to be my final prayer, Maria. But all of a sudden, I started to feel something completely different from the panic that had engulfed me that night. It was like a kind of relief of endless peace, something I can only describe in that way. There was no fear or worry about what would happen, just a feeling of tranquility as if everything was fine and calm, something I had never experienced in my life. After a moment, I opened my eyes and saw that figure had his bony. I put my index finger on my forehead, but as soon as I opened my eyes, he started to fade away. Oddly though, I didn't feel fear or anything else again. Instead, I felt a sense of clarity and calmness that I hadn't experienced in a long time. The figure had already disappeared, and the dawn had completely dispelled the night's darkness by tinging the sky with reddish and golden hues. I'm not sure if that was a sign that I should do something with my life. It wasn't a dream. Something changed in me that night. The following morning, I went to the church and told the priest what I had gone through. He gave me a close look and advised me to make the most of my second chance when God gives it. After I left, I went to a nearby store and asked the owner for a job, almost certain that she would turn me down like everyone else did when they saw how I looked. However, she gave me a job as a cleaner that day, along with clean clothes and shoes. And that was the start of a transformation that even in the months that followed, I was able to find housing, and now, 10 years later, I am in charge of the maintenance crew in that same warehouse. I have never returned to the music streets. Amir was a homeless person who lived near my university, and I always gave him my spare change when I had extra. I only did this with him because I usually strictly refrain from giving money to people like this. Instead, I donate to well-known and respected charities in the area where I can be sure that the fund will be donated to a particular cause. But Amir was unique. He didn't just ask for money. Instead, he sang opera and did it incredibly well. All things considered, it was obvious that the heir was begging for money due to his lack of housing and the poverty in which he lived. But I always found it admirable that he was attempting to provide a service in exchange for the money he received from people rather than just begging, which is why I always worked with him. In addition, I don't like carrying coins, so I always gave. Since he enjoyed making the students laugh with his jokes, I would occasionally engage Amir in conversation, even if I didn't have any money to give him at the time. He was a person with a medium level of culture, but he was older than me. He must have been between 40 and 50 years old, so we didn't have many topics of conversation in common. Instead, we mainly talked quickly about the news or the weather or anything else. But occasionally he would haphazardly share something so private that I felt obliged to return the favor with something at least somewhat personal. For instance, once he told me that he nearly attended college on a baseball scholarship, but that drugs destroyed everything. I simply said, "Oh boy, I'm sorry to hear that you didn't get to take advantage of that scholarship," or something similar. He was kind to me, and I returned the favor because I was never prejudiced and had no personal agenda. I just never thought that having a small friendship with someone in his condition would lead me to experience the hell I did shortly after. One day, Amir called out to me while I was walking down the street with a teacher. I didn't want to be impolite, so I went over to greet him and introduce myself. When we left, my teacher was shocked and asked me how Amir knew my name. I told him about our small friendship, but he said something that I didn't understand. He explained that the homeless people in this city were different from those in my small hometown. At the time, I thought he was being a little elitist, but I believe he realized I didn't take him seriously because, right before I left, he reiterated to me that I shouldn't make friends with or even give money to the city's homeless population because the majority of the street people, like Amir, had serious addiction issues, and most of them had. I must admit that I was shocked because this professor used to be very progressive and caring. I tried to convince him by presenting Air as a victim of a post-capitalist society and everything else I had learned in his classes, but he essentially meant none of it. I continued by saying that Amir became chronically homeless due to the system, so we should now act appropriately and not stigmatize someone for a situation that any of us could experience. Just begged me to stop talking to Air at all. I shook my head, thinking, okay, boomer. I felt this warning as if it was confirmation that he was being classist and I was doing the right thing, leading a new way, breaking down barriers, and improving society. The following day, I went over to where he was and wanted to spend some time with Air, but he was very irritable and distant this time, and I wasn't sure why until he said, "What about your boyfriend? Do you two live together or what?" I had no idea what he was talking about. In response to my question, "What boyfriend?" he said, "The guy I met yesterday, you were walking down the street with him." I laughed and told him that he wasn't my boyfriend, but rather my professor and academic advisor. Suddenly, he stopped being irritable and became more talkative than ever. I probably should have taken this as a warning sign, but I didn't give it much thought. After that, I only saw Amir once or twice a week, and only for a few minutes. From that point on, he began bringing me gifts whenever I passed by. My flatmate once commented on the flower when he sang opera, and when I explained it to her, she said it was strange. I thought she was being elitist too, and that I was an enlightened class divide, saving enlightenment, and that I was far superior to her neoliberal paranoia. Come on, it was just a flower. No big deal, my advisor noted. So I never refused him a flower, a piece of metal machinery, or anything else because I believed that he was maintaining his dignity by taking my money. I tried to tell him about Amir's opera singing, his impressions, and how he nearly went to college, but I stopped dead in my tracks when I realized why he lost his baseball scholarship. Seeing things through that lens made me reevaluate everything I thought about what my professor had told me, skipping the details. We spoke for 30 minutes before I finally made the connection. Amir brought up all of this to me again a while later, stating that he was concerned that I was being manipulated. When I learned that Amir had a lengthy history of substance abuse, and that occasionally he would talk about how his girlfriend had overreacted to something he had done and how that had ruined his life. In addition to the drugs, I thought maybe I should give it some serious thought about moving away from Air for a while. However, it didn't work out because the pandemic struck shortly after and classes were moved online, so I moved in with my parents to save money on rent. They lived in the same state, but it wasn't close to the campus. About 3 weeks after returning home, I was browsing through a friend's Instagram story when I heard Air's opera singing in the background. I assumed that I had forgotten about him and hoped he was doing well, but I continued to look at other stories. Later that night, something about the story kept coming up in my head and stomach, so I ignored it. However, it kept coming back, so I went back to watch the story again, and that's when I realized that my friend's video wasn't from our call town, but rather, I was a little afraid because my hometown was much smaller and not close to my college. This was especially true when I told him in one of our conversations that my family still lived there, but I reassured myself that they had all moved away when the pandemic struck. And even though my town wasn't close to the university, it wasn't like it was on the other side of the country, so it might have just been a coincidence. I really wanted to tell my parents about it, but they had. I felt too embarrassed to explain the situation to homeless people who always told me not to talk to them about anything other than whether I could buy them lunch. In addition, I thought it was very arrogant of me to say that he followed me here because, come on, I'm not cool enough for someone to be obsessed with me. We take quarantine very seriously because we have a type 1 diabetic in the family. I assumed I wouldn't see him again because I'm not going anywhere anytime soon, so it's okay. But one day during a phone call, my high school friend who ended up at my college said, "I know this is going to sound really weird, But I feel like I should tell you that I was downtown and a panhandler asked me about you specifically. He knew you were in a social science club, and he knew your major. I didn't tell him anything, but I was initially quite alarmed because I didn't think he would know that I knew this girl. However, after we spoke, I realized that she had been wearing a college sweatshirt. So I considered the possibility that he had seen that sweatshirt, and I speculated that he might have known me from college because we both lived in the same town. I thought it was very kind of him, but it was also strange. But hey, he was a little strange, which was part of his charm. I thanked my friend for calling to inform me of this, but I told her not to worry because I wasn't in town for very long. I also decided to move back to live close to campus because it was impossible to finish my studies with all of my family around all day. So I went back. I didn't give Air any thought until I saw him again a week after I had returned to campus. I knew something was wrong, so I stopped talking to him and giving him money. But I felt foolish about how loudly I had been insisting that everything was fine and that everyone else was elitist and paranoid. I decided not to tell anyone what I had noticed because it would be too embarrassing to have to retract my statements and acknowledge in front of them that they were correct. After final exams, I decided to visit my brother in a different state because his roommates had moved out, leaving an extra bed. So I drove to his house to celebrate the end of the year and get away from it all. I barely left my dorm and never went to campus by the usual route because I didn't want to run into him. I felt a little bad about hurting his feelings, but I figured he would get the message and better safe than sorry. On the 9th day, an unusual sound woke me up much earlier than usual since my brother doesn't work or attend school. He sleeps until around noon, so I thought it was odd to hear him talking at the door that day. I got up to find out what was going on because we hadn't seen anyone since the quarantine began. As I left the room, I could tell that my brother's condition had changed somewhat, even though he was politely speaking to someone outside through the door's crack. When he turned around, he saw me very angry, and I wasn't sure who he was speaking to because I didn't catch A. The only rational thought I could come up with first thing in the morning was that the police had come to arrest me for something. However, the only thing I could imagine they would arrest me for was my fake ID, which I only used to get into concerts and night spots, obviously. I had a brief glimpse of the person on the other side before he closed the door and walked over to me, standing directly in front of my face, and whispered, almost shouting, "Mom and Dad are going to kill you for this." None recently. I was still in shock, but my brother was still very upset with me, telling me that I was in serious trouble and other things like, "Why the hell didn't you tell me what the __ were you thinking?" When I realized that didn't fit with getting arrested, I finally asked him what he was talking about, and to my complete surprise, he said, "You're dating a 50-year-old guy, Dad will kill you, and then he'll have a heart attack and die too, which will kill Mom. And on top of that, you." I listened carefully and in silence to my brother's threats, who was obviously about to have a breakdown due to how furious he was. But I had no idea what he was talking about and couldn't even make the connections at the time because there was only a very small part of my life. "You two can go to a hotel because he's not coming in here. You saved yourself that I wasn't a jerk to him, but I'm warning you that if you don't tell him to leave now, things will change drastically." My brother seemed ready to grab me by the collar and said, "We're adults, come on. Don't lie to me, I'm not Mom or Dad. I can't help you with this if you're going to lie to my face." I reiterated that I wasn't lying, and I said, "Dude, I don't know why you're getting so mad at me. I don't even have a boyfriend. I don't know what you're talking about. Someone's at the wrong house." He knows me very well, so I assumed he could tell by my tone and expression that I was being honest. Now, he was just as confused and irritated as I was. Then he said he was here about his girlfriend, and he used your name. He recited a lot of very accurate information, and I believe he said that you two got into a fight and that he was here to make things right. At that point, I felt a deep emptiness in the pit of my stomach because that was the only thing that came to mind. It would be unsettling if this occurred at my house or on campus, but at least he already knew that information. However, in this instance, I moved states because my brother moved here to attend school, and I only know him and his friends. So I did the obvious and went to see who the person at the door was. I must admit that when I first saw him, I almost didn't recognize him because he had showered, shaved, and was wearing clean clothes for the first time since I've known him. It was Air standing at my brother's door hundreds of miles from his corner next to campus. I was so terrified that I was unable to speak, and my heart was racing like I was slipping under deep water with my legs tied together. I simply walked away from the door and sat on the couch, trying to gather myself. My brother believed that this was my confirmation that he was, in fact, my boyfriend, as if my biggest secret had been revealed, but the reality was much worse. When he saw that I was crying, he sat down. I managed to control my panic long enough to explain to him in broad strokes what was really going on, but I don't think he fully understood how. He calmed down, apologized, and tried to comfort me, still believing that my state was caused by him discovering my relationship with a 40-year-old. You just don't understand. He followed me here, and my brother didn't understand, thinking I didn't want him here, and asked me why we fought, even though he believed this guy was actually my boyfriend. He began to joke about it, telling me it was funny and that he would take care of it. Then he went to the door and told him that he had just realized I wasn't home and that I must have packed up and left early. He also suggested that he should do the same because he was taking the quarantine very seriously. However, after he turned to face me and winked, he realized that this was more serious than he had initially thought, and Amir told him in a rather hostile tone that he was lying ass. He heard me say, "I heard her there talking to you. Tell her I'm sorry. I don't know why she's been avoiding me, but I cleaned up for her, and I'll take her wherever she wants to go," in a demanding tone. I wanted to tell her this and don't lie to me because I will know if you do that really upset my brother, he said. "Brother, you're not taking her anywhere. Get off my terrace before we have a serious problem." It sounded like Amir was leaving, but he was actually approaching the window when I noticed. He looked completely different from how I had seen him even just seconds earlier. His clothes were clean and he was well-groomed, but his eyes were bugged out of his head and there was white stuff stuck in the corners of his mouth, which I hadn't noticed at first. He was also shaking a little, and it was obvious that he was completely out of touch with reality. He began hammering on the windows and shouting things like, "That's my girlfriend, you can't keep her in there, let her out." My brother was so shocked by this man's sudden outburst that he was preparing to confront him forcefully, but I was trying to make my voice work to beg him not to. I was so nervous, scared, embarrassed, and sad that I had ignored all the warning signs in front of my eyes so many times that I was now in this situation not knowing what to do. "I'm coming for you, baby. I'm coming to rescue you." I had plenty of opportunities to stop this situation, but I just didn't do it. Now that I knew what to do, all I could think about was that this man could hurt my brother and me, and that I could have avoided this only if I had been more mature and less arrogant with all that progressive crap in my head. I was in the middle of a very dangerous situation, and I had no idea how to fix it. I was so terrified and had so many thoughts racing through my head that all I could do was scream. But not scream words. My brother was trying to push me away from the door so he could face me, but I begged him not to. My brother is an athletic guy, but I don't think he's ever been in a physical situation. During that struggle, there was a sound like glass breaking and falling to the floor, and that's when we saw Amir's arm through the window. At that moment, there was an eerie silence for a moment where no one moved. I screamed my head off. Then Amir began screaming things with much less sense than before. "Look what you did to me. This is a test. I told you they couldn't stop me. I'm invincible," and other things without the slightest coherence. His eyes became more distant and completely unreal, and my brother saw all the blood splattered all over the floor. I thought I had even stopped screaming, but when he withdrew his hand, everything went into chaos. A lot of blood began to spill as he pulled his hand through the glass. Started screaming because he was always extremely sensitive to it, but this also made him realize that we were in danger. He finally yelled at me to call 911. "Would you?" As he leaned against the door, which Amir was kicking very hard at the time. As I reached for my phone, I looked out the window and was horrified to see that Air was holding a large, sharp piece of glass in his hand. If I was already panicking, I was now just in the middle of a nervous. When I had a breakdown, I began screaming at my brother to stay close to the door and telling him what this insane man was holding. I was so terrified that I don't even remember calling 911, but I definitely did because 10 minutes later, a police car pulled up and they acted quickly to arrest him. I had never experienced such a strange mixture of relief and panic in my life, but that's exactly how it felt. As the officers led him to the patrol car, he kept trying to explain that his girlfriend was trapped in the house, and when Amir was taken away in the back of the patrol car, he began singing opera, which was really creepy, like something out of a horror movie. After that, we filed a formal complaint, and Air faced charges of kidnapping. My poor brother was even briefly handcuffed and had to explain that he had not taken me hostage until I was finally able to articulate and explain to them over the top what had really happened. Assault, trespassing, harassment, and a few other counts that I can't recall at the moment. But I do recall that this individual had previously received 2 citations for sexual harassment and aggravated assault. I hope your day is filled with health and joy. I invite you to subscribe to my channel to hear true horror stories. Hello, and see you again.